Welcome to SPRingBoard. I'm your host, Ahlia Bethea, and today we're diving into one of the most urgent and complex challenges of our time, the environmental impact and promise of artificial intelligence. This episode may get a little technical, so I'll define a few key terms before we dive in. Generative AI refers to artificial intelligence that can create new content, like text, images, music, or code, based on patterns it has learned from existing data. Large language models, or LLMs, are a type of generative AI trained on massive amounts of text. They can understand and generate human-like language, making them useful for tasks like writing, summarizing, translating, and answering questions. As AI continues to transform industries, it also raises profound questions about sustainability, ethics, and regulation. What is the hidden cost of training massive generative AI models? Can machine learning help us adapt to climate change and secure global food systems? And what role should the legal community play in guiding this technological evolution responsibly? To explore these questions, we're joined by two visionary guests. Dr. Shaolei Ren is an associate professor of electrical and computer engineering at UC Riverside, whose groundbreaking research on the water and air quality impacts of data centers is reshaping how we think about sustainable AI. And Will Kletter, who is COO of ClimateAi, a company using predictive analytics to build climate resilience in agriculture and supply chains. Predictive models use historical data to forecast future outcomes. Think smart weather forecasts. They're trained on past patterns to anticipate what's likely to happen next. Together, we'll unpack the environmental risks and opportunities of AI, from the carbon footprint of data centers to the potential for machine learning to safeguard food security in a warming world. So whether you're a lawyer, a tech innovator, policymaker, or just a curious mind, this episode is for you. Welcome to SPRingBoard, Dr. Ren and Will Kletter.
Great. Well, thank you so much for having me. And Dr. Ren, a pleasure to be on with you today.
Thanks for having me. It's great to be here.
Thank you both for being here. Let's get started. AI is often hailed as a revolutionary force, but it's also increasingly scrutinized for its environmental footprint. From your vantage points in academia and industry, how do you see the relationship between AI and the environment evolving? Is it more of a threat, an opportunity, or something in between?
I think about AI as ultimately it's a tool. And so whether it's a threat or an opportunity depends on how we use it. Certainly, there's a lot of use cases we see right now in the environmental space that are very exciting, from optimizing routes to reduce emissions associated with transport, increasing the deployment of renewables, optimizing EV charging, or in the case of ClimateAi, helping supply chains and governments adapt to the impact of extreme weather and safeguard farmer livelihoods. So there's certainly a lot of positives that can be realized. And I think there's sort of a lot of future potentially game-changing initiatives. The one that gets talked a lot about is fusion. And if AI can lead to the commercialization of fusion technology, this debate will be quite moot.
For our listeners who don't know, AI is being contemplated for use in fusion energy research. Yes, that concept from high school physics class, where the nuclei of light atoms are forced together to form a heavier atom. Generative AI is being used for that, or at least that's what scientists are hoping.
But that's pretty far out. And in the meantime, there's going to be some very real and very significant environmental impacts from this increasing energy demand. And to me, I don't think of these things that necessarily need to operate as a trade-off. I think there's absolutely room for appropriate regulatory frameworks to think about how do we capture the benefits of these new exciting tools while minimizing the externalities from the outset, rather than look back 10 years from now and then start to unwind damage after it's already occurred.
Dr. Ren, what do you think? Is it a threat, an opportunity, or somewhere in the middle?
I think just as any other technologies, AI is not an exception. It has some immediate resource consumption, including energy, water, and has some carbon emission, air pollution problems. But just as Will pointed out, it really depends on your usage. If you're using AI for good, I'm not seeing any strong reasons of not using that. For example, a lot of my research is using AI to help optimize the decision-making process we have in some very complex environments. For example, integrating renewables into the power system, managing complex data center cooling systems. Those traditional approaches rely on manual human efforts and expertise. I really think overall AI is really a great tool if you use it well.
And, there's definitely a lot of opportunity here. And both of you mentioned that in your responses. But let's talk about what really is the cost of this opportunity to scale. Dr. Ren, could you talk to us a little bit about your research on public health and environmental impacts? There are a lot of energy demands, and the carbon intensity of these data centers is coming up very frequently in the news. So while there are these benefits, can you talk to us about what your research is showing in terms of the cost?
Sure. So we try to make AI technologies better and more responsible, more sustainable. So to do so, I think it's a crucial part is to really understand the true cost of the data center in terms of our natural resources and our environment. So the next part I'm going to be talking about is more on the negative side, but that doesn't mean I'm really against this technology. They absolutely not shouldn't be interpreted in that way. So a lot of people have been studying this global environmental impacts of AI or generally data centers. For example, they focus on carbon footprint, which has this global climate change impacts. My research is more focused on the local and regional impacts, including the water and air quality. So let's start maybe the water issue, because data center uses water. I mean, a lot of them use water for cooling, and also they indirectly consume water for generating electricity. In the same way as we account for carbon emissions to the electricity usage, we also attribute some of the water consumption for generating electricity to these end users like data centers. So compared to among these two parts, indirect water consumption for generating electricity is more dominant usually. So we show that in 2023, if you had a conversation about 10 to 50 queries with a medium-sized language model, it could consume about 500 milliliters water. And of course, that estimate was in 2023. So this year and now today, this number will likely be decreasing.
Dr. Ren, I selfishly chose this topic for the podcast because I saw those news articles about the 500 milliliters of water, and I couldn't believe the consumption that such a small query would require. And given the scale of people and the use of this technology, I wondered how accurate that information was. But it sounds like you're saying it's accurate, but it's getting better.
I think as a researcher, I have to clarify it to the best extent that I can explain. So the estimate was for a medium-sized language model. It's GPT-3 as example. In 2023, if you had a conversation with about 10 to 50 queries, medium-sized queries, so each having about 150 to 300 words, then overall you could consume roughly 500 milliliters water. And this water includes both direct water consumption for cooling the data centers and also indirect water consumption for generating electricity. And this number was estimated based on public sources as of 2023, with a few updates in 2024. But still, it's like 1 and 2 years old. So today, the number is likely lower, but we don't really have a good answer now. We have seen some self-reports from a few companies. For example, Mistral reported that using their medium-size, actually large-size model, it will consume 45 milliliters water for each query with about 400 tokens. That's about 1 page of content. So if you generate 1 page of content using Mistral's chatbots, then there will be 45 milliliters water. And that water is for the total life cycle. On the other hand, we're also seeing some reports from a blog or from a internal study released in the public domain that if you had a conversation with their models, the water consumption just a few drops or like sub milliliters. And I would say all those numbers could be correct in their own context, but if you put them together, the comparison is probably not really meaningful because they have very different model sizes, very different output lenses.
Will, I'd love to hear a little bit of your perspective on what we're talking about in terms of these environmental trade-offs from your vantage point at ClimateAi. How do you see the environmental costs of AI playing out in the broader climate tech space? Are companies reckoning with these trade-offs?
Think so. I think again, it comes back to kind of the use case here, and that the reality when we're talking about the environmental impacts of AI, we are focused primarily on the kind of large language models and the very, very common use cases that we see around things like coding and personal consumption. And I think we'll start to see, as more and more companies adopt AI, that footprint grow, and then grow very quickly. But those are going to be kind of the large drivers that we see. And so in some sense, the conversation of like for climate tech companies and companies using AI for good, as Dr. Ren said, is very unlikely to ever be a meaningful piece of that overall consumption pie. And so for folks that are applying AI to use cases that can reduce environmental impacts or, promote public health, promote climate resilience, that trade-off I think is going to be pretty clearly in the positive, pretty quickly. I think it's sort of these much larger, higher driver use cases that we're going to see drive impact. Here, the challenging thing is that these are mostly, this is not sort of someone's finger on the button. This is millions, if not billions, of individual decisions that are driving this footprint. And so that's where, to me, it becomes a question of what are those points of leverage? There's certainly a regulatory point of leverage. I think the trend that we're seeing on disclosure from folks like Google is really positive in terms of, at the very least, starting to shine a light on this usage that may ultimately promote behavior change from some of the larger players by creating kind of that public pressure around it. And then I'd also be curious to hear from Dr. Ren what he sees as some of those larger levers, because I do think we're going to have to think about it from a system perspective rather than sort of how do we quote unquote bring down AI consumption, because again it's hundreds of millions, if not billions, of individual decisions.
Absolutely. Dr. Ren, what from your perspective are some of those larger levers?
I think the individual user's decision helps, but it's probably not going to be the major driver for sustainability improvement. But on the other hand, I'm seeing, I think those tech companies themselves do have the right incentive to reduce their resource consumption, reduce their energy and environmental footprint, because they are competing with each other in a very intense space. So if they're not doing well in their resource efficiency for their AI models, they will be sooner or later losing in the game.
Just to add to that, I think that's a really key point, that there is a strong incentive in place to use the right model for the right purpose, in terms of the size and computational intensity of the model. I think while sort of the big models with the large context windows get a lot of the press, I think when it comes to practical applications, certainly a lot of the AI work that we're doing at ClimateAi, our AI team is always thrilled when they can say, we actually used a much simpler model that's much computationally cheaper because it does the same job, it costs less, and usually is also easier to interpret. And so that really helps when we are trying to communicate to our customers what's going on in the black box, so to speak. So I agree with Dr. Ren, there's a lot of incentives for companies to optimize on what model you're using, which optimizes on cost, i.e. optimizes on energy consumption, and so optimizes on impact. The one sort of area that is maybe a bit more concerning is around some of the local impacts, which pollution doesn't cost anything really. I mean, it does in the sense that it's related to energy use. Water is probably not appropriately priced in certain environments, especially in water scarce areas. So those are areas where there may be more of that regulatory opportunity to to step in because the natural incentives aren't the same as just sort of purely reducing energy footprint, which I think every large language model would love to get their footprint down to as close to zero as possible.
That's a really great point. So basically reducing energy helps reducing other type of footprint, but not necessarily minimizing the other footprint. So like the carbon, water, air pollution, they are not priced well. And, if you're not paying for that, probably it's not going to be in a very priority position to minimize when you try to make our decisions. So I think we need to make sure those are properly taken into account by those companies.
You both are starting to go in this direction. I'd love to hone in on policy a little bit. It sounds like right now, just the market pressures and the competition is what's driving this this incentive to be more efficient as an AI company. Do you both see any specific areas where you feel that there is a regulatory gap that could add some of this necessary pressure to motivate these companies to become more efficient faster? Or
I think the policy or regulatory framework can play a significant role in improving the sustainability, but it varies a lot depending on the countries. In European countries, I think they will have a more powerful role than in the US. But in any case, I think at least requiring some standardized reporting and transparency would be really helpful and not really holding them back for advancement.
Will, does ClimateAi help its clients think about these sort of emissions mitigations and regulatory compliance, or what part do you play in this planning?
Yeah, so we're focused on helping companies think about the risks that come from operating in a changing climate, and water is a major piece of that. So when we work with beer companies as an example. Well, water is one of their primary ingredients, and so if they're locating in areas where they may face water scarcity in the future, that risks having their plants be shut down because there's insufficient water, and the population of maybe a nearby city typically would come first. That's not always the case, but that's something that we've seen happen in different parts of the world already, and so that's something that's very top of mind in the food and agriculture space. And I would suspect that it's top of mind or going to be top of mind from folks citing data centers of where are we going to be able to effectively draw the natural resources we need to operate at the intensity that we need to operate at. And I do think that there is a lot, well, in theory, that everything I just said has nothing to do with using less resources. I do think that when we think about where and how we build data centers, if we think about natural resources as an important variable, non-limitless variable that we need to account for when we site data centers, there's already opportunities to reduce the impact, i.e. of, polluting in areas that aren't close to population centers, siting data centers in areas that are relatively water abundant versus relatively water scarce. And so I think in a lot of, as we plan, ClimateAi helping companies plan their site selection to be the most resource efficient, inherently that will reduce some of the negative externalities that we see.
And to what extent has the use of AI improved ClimateAi's ability to be more accurate in terms of this predictive analytics and citing of locations? How does AI actually integrate into the work that you're doing?
Yeah, so there's a couple different ways. I'll just give two quick examples. So one is let's talk about the forecast piece, and then there's a second piece that we like to call the impact. So what does the forecast mean to me? So one is something very basic when we think about existing long-term climate models or short-term weather models, is that they're very low resolution. So typically between 25 kilometers by 25 kilometers, or even 50 by 50, 100 by 100. So very coarse, very hard to get insights that would pass an investment committee meeting. insights that are really sort of robust and defensible, that this sort of long-term climate model truly applies to this site, and thus I can make a different capital decision than I would have otherwise. So one way that we're using AI is to build a relationship between these lower resolution models and high resolution observed data or ground truth, so that when we forecast something, we are saying, all right, well, the low resolution model may say it's going to be 100 degrees on August 26th, but using our AI translation to this individual site at a 1 kilometer by 1 kilometer resolution, we would see that it's actually going to be 101.5 degrees. And these sort of differences seem small, but over time they can accumulate, whether you're trying to estimate cooling costs, as would be the case of the data center, or in the case of agriculture, trying to understand if will the crop be negatively impacted by critical thresholds being breached. I think the other place, and this is where we see a lot of potential, is in applying these in what we call sort of impact or industry focused data sets. So applying these forecasts to the what does it mean for me question. And here we have been able to build a very robust global library of crop models that are using what we call biophysics-based AI. So starting with an initial model that's heavily constrained based on academic literature as it pertains to agronomy and how plants respond, but then very quickly train on local data for yield and other factors, local weather data, to localize these crop models all over the world and give our customers a better perspective on how changing weather impacts crops, not just in places like the US, which are obviously very well covered, but in the global South as well, to give a better perspective of the global food system. And I think that ability to rapidly scale predictive modeling is something that is really, AI makes significantly easier, both in the sense of training the models themselves, but even in cleaning the data to train the models, which is another use case that we see a lot of.
And when it comes to planning for the future, how far ahead can your models reliably forecast? Have you encountered any challenges with prediction accuracy?
Absolutely. I mean, the reality is any prediction is, it's a prediction, it's not a crystal ball. And so I think for us, we focus on two time horizons. One is seasonal timescales going out to 6 months, and the other is long-term climate, 10, 20, 50 years into the future. And the way I describe accuracy is we like to, of course, we provide a lot of quantitative accuracy, but we think about it more in terms of decision accuracy. There's inherent uncertainty in any prediction, but is it accurate enough to help a customer make a decision? So for example, if we can accurately forecast 3 to 4 months out that there will be a meaningful heat wave in the Corn Belt of Iowa that will negatively impact corn yields, it doesn't necessarily matter if we get the exact timing of that heat wave or the exact degree of that heat wave correct, as long as we can say with high confidence it exceeds a threshold that data shows will damage yield. And so over those longer term time scales, that is sort of the type of, let's say, leading indicator that we're trying to focus on. And then as events become closer and closer in time, and you start to think about how might I as a grower address that risk, well, then I really do need a lot more precision as to, when is it coming? How hot is it truly going to be? Is it going to be bad for the crop? Could it be bad for people as well? Is there any risk of me working outside under those conditions? And so our precision increases as we move forward in time. And I think the thing that we've learned a lot about as a business is how to find those customers and use cases where their decision timescales and decision-making processes are aligned to what we can confidently deliver over those different time horizons. But it hasn't always been easy. I think there's a lot of folks that inherently struggle with and use cases that just don't lend themselves to decision-making under uncertainty. And there's been a learning curve there, but thankfully we've been able to climb it.
Dr. Ren, Will mentioned the ability of their technology to even help clean their data. What do you think about the potential for predictive models to be used to anticipate the environmental risks from AI infrastructure itself? Or is it a cut your nose to spite your face sort of situation? Or is it, as you were alluding to earlier, the trade-offs are going to be worth it for us using the technology?
So far in our experience, I think AI or generally machine learning predictions is helping us optimize our decision in much better than human expertise. For example, a lot of our research is about learning augmented decision making. We try to leverage predictions to help us make the decision. Otherwise, we're just making decision without foreseeing the future. So it's really for myopic decision versus foresighted decisions. Whether AI prediction accuracy is good or bad, I think as Will pointed out, it really depends on the context. The accuracy or the prediction accuracy itself is important, but what matters more is the how it affects your decision quality. And this is something we call decision oriented or decision focused learning. So we try to not only improve the prediction accuracy, but also try to use the decision quality or the impact on the downstream tasks as our loss function when we train the machine learning models. So I think overall, we're seeing a lot of help from this machine learning prediction to help us make better decisions in many different tasks, because we're mostly doing some fundamental research, not really on those specific tasks, but we do look at a few case studies like data centers, smart grid, battery management system, and they have all shown very promising results.
Could you explain what you mean by decision-oriented tasks?
Sure. So in our research, by the way, AI is really an umbrella term. It has this generative AI like large language models. It also has this very simple classification models. So in our research, we primarily look at these prediction models. Traditionally, when people train this prediction model, they have to design a loss function. And this loss function often focuses on the accuracy of the prediction. So basically, compared to the ground truth label or ground truth prediction, how far away your predicted value is from the ground truth. And this is an important metric, but it doesn't really reflect how well it will impact your decision. For some tasks, it could be really relying on your decision accuracy, but for other tasks, like Will pointed out, it probably, as long as you're able to predict the trend, then that's good enough. So decision-focused learning or decision-oriented learning basically tries to incorporate the decision impact or how the prediction will affect the decision quality into account when you do the training process. So we not only look at the accuracy or traditional loss functions, but also look at this decision quality. And this will balance the performance of the prediction to steer it towards not only try to stay close to the ground truth labels, but also try to really help the downstream decision-making processes.
Thank you for that. I want to spend a little bit more time honing in on the social justice implications of the continued use of this technology, but also, as we've been discussing, the potential for this technology to help us rid ourselves of some of these social issues or to help mitigate some of the negative impacts. Will, do you think that consumers and your clients are acutely aware of the environmental footprint of the tools they're using? Or do you feel that there's still a need to nudge them to move in more sustainable directions and to take advantage of some of the predictive technology with that ClimateAi or similar companies are providing?
Well, I think Dr. Ren hit on this very well earlier when he talked about the one great step from a regulatory standpoint would be to increase transparency and maybe even codify reporting standards around impacts. Because I think at the end of the day, the old adage, what gets measured gets managed, has been consistently true in the environmental world to some extent. And so I do think the more consumers whether a thing in their personal lives or their professional lives are made aware of the costs, not just of AI use, but of other actions in their life, like taking a plane or eating a hamburger, that would allow them to make their own trade-offs and apply their own loss function, even if there is no kind of carbon tax associated with that. What I see right now is quite a bit of confusion. But it was at a climate tech networking event recently, and someone came up to us and was asking, should I not be using AI anymore? And they had just been talking about a big trip that they went on. And it's like, to be clear, the trip that you took was definitely worse. That's not to say that they shouldn't go on a trip or use AI, but I see just sort of a lack of information. And so I do think increasing transparency, one, and then to your question, certainly I can absolutely imagine a use case where an AI tool can look at your own life and identify very low-hanging fruit of carbon that you can reduce. There's an organization actually called Carbon Trace, which has found that there are a lot of ways that we can immediately reduce energy and thus carbon emissions in ways that have virtually no economic impact. And so I certainly think that this optimization problem, whether it's identifying specific practice changes or nudge behavior, can be great, but I don't think we have sufficient data on the environmental costs in a consistent way yet to really do that in the AI realm.
Could you clarify what you mean when you say we do not have sufficient data on the environmental costs? For me, it draws a striking comparison to the burning of fossil fuels and our understanding of greenhouse gas emissions. Tremendous societal benefits, while there are also significant environmental harms. Given that historical context and understanding of how climate, environmental, and health impacts can be ignored while we're trying to, quote, understand impacts, what more do we need to know, and should we be continuing to scale our use of these systems if there are such unknowns?
So maybe just to clarify, I think when I say sort of insufficient data, I think that would be more in terms of solving the optimization problem of how bad is kind of a query versus some other factors in your life. Because that I think to our discussion on decision making earlier may require a level of precision, which based on the published estimates on what AI impacts the environment are today, there's some variance, right? I don't think we need more information to say that pollution is bad, that carbon emissions create a significant global externality and usually associated with local impacts, and that excessive water consumption is something that should be limited, and companies need to either use water more efficiently or locate in areas that there is abundant water supply. So I think in some ways and I think this is kind of the point you're making, the regulations on data centers fit the same regulations that we'd have of any industrial level activity, or rather should have on any industrial level activity, and that these negative environmental externalities can and should be limited. And I don't think that there's more information needed to at least start down that road.
Thanks for that. I'm happy to know there's no need for delay on this point. So we've gotten into the weeds a bit, but I'd like to zoom out for a second. Do either of you have any knowledge of policies in other countries pertaining to their management of the use of AI that might be applicable here in the United States?
I think in Europe, there's a EU-wide directive that requires every member state to implement some national laws that will require data centers to report their energy, water, and carbon. This is not specifically for AI, but just for general data centers. And in the United States, I'm not aware of any federal level laws or regulations that are similar as the EU-wide directive. But in some state levels, we're seeing some efforts like pushing for energy and carbon and sometimes water reporting when they build their data centers in the public domain. So it's changing, but in different ways than Europe.
Will, any thoughts on that?
I think I maybe speaking kind of more generally is that just policies that enable rapid deployment of renewables. I think we certainly see in China that, of course, there's the deployment of all sorts of energies, but renewables significantly included in the mix. These are things that, regardless of if we remove AI and just think about increasing power demand, which is where we find ourselves, we have some options as how to meet that demand. And there is, from the environmental perspective, very obviously a correct choice. And I also think that we see even within the United States, some states that are more friendly for the development of new projects of any kind, inclusive of energy projects. And so I think, one thing that may be more addressable, I do think sort of disclosure requirements, to Dr. Ren's point, are a way to provide regulation without actually slowing down progress and striking the balance well. But I also think if we can think about regulation as less about doing less bad. Not that we shouldn't, but it just seems like there may not be the political will at the moment in the United States. But instead, how do we do more good? How do we deploy more renewables? How do we take another look at nuclear as a potential option? Of course, a controversial topic, but something that at least needs to be on the table as part of this conversation. And so I do think potentially maybe that do more good angle could be something that there may be traction on, at least at the state level.
That's amazing. I love that reframing. So you're essentially saying that rather than trying to use AI to clean up the mess or fix our mistakes, why not from the onset we're using it to shape positive action? So do you both agree that AI can be used to shape behavior in ways that may actually be beneficial to the environment and it sounds like potentially society overall?
I think so. For, let's say, using the energy, so it's the supply side, supplying the grid with more clean energy, carbon-free energy. This is the supply side solution. And if you're, let's say, for data center, we try to locate the data center in certain places with the less climate change impact. This is on the demand side solution. I think both side solutions are both important, and the supply side is probably the main driver in the long run. And but demand side solution will be immediately useful, I think.
We are coming up on the end of our episode. We've certainly discussed a lot, but I'd like to give each of you an opportunity for some closing thoughts. As we wrap up, is there a final insight, takeaway, or message that you'd like to share with our listeners?
Yeah, I think, one thing that I think it's really important in this conversation to, we've talked a lot about the negative externalities on the environment, both in terms of water and local impacts, but also in terms of global impacts of climate change. And I think, to shamelessly plug the work we do at ClimateAi for a moment, I think in general, we see less emphasis on protecting populations from many of the impacts of climate change that we already see and expect to see in the future and will see regardless of any actions that we take today, because to some extent, some amount of warming is already baked in. And so I do think that as we think about, this conversation with the role that AI can play or how we need to think about new regulatory frameworks, I would just encourage folks to also think about the fact that increasing extreme weather, increasing food scarcity, increasing water scarcity are impacts that we're going to see, and they deserve a lot of attention and focus as well.
Absolutely. Dr. Ren, any closing thoughts?
I think it's important to understand the environmental and the resource consumption of AI, including energy. Unfortunately, we also see some too extreme positions on this point. For example, one side says this is just purely anti-AI. The other side says AI is using negligible energy. So I think it's not a binary choice. We are just looking at this problem to inform our decision making. Just let's look at this problem in a more evidence-based approach and scientific approach.
I think we're all in agreement. And I think the caveat to that is while we're having that science-based approach, it's just remaining cognizant of the context, to quote Kamala Harris, to remain cognizant of the context in which we exist, and that we have that historical understanding of what investment in certain technologies can do to communities, can do to the environment. And so acting in a responsible way with that knowledge to be as efficient as possible, I think is certainly critical. I really appreciate you both being here with us today. Thank you to all of our listeners from SPRingBoard. This has been a very fascinating episode, and we look forward to seeing you soon. Thank you. The content of this podcast and its supplemental material is for informational purposes only and should not be considered legal advice. The views and opinions expressed in this program are those of the speakers in their individual capacities and do not necessarily reflect the views or opinions of Cy Padgett and Rizal and/or any of the clients they represent.